Tonight, a musical essay which reveals a heart in pilgrimage.
Tonight, Paul Crossley explores how Franz Liszt's music and life intertwine, and he plays several of Liszt's major piano works written over a span of 60 years. Composing was for Liszt a journey of self-knowledge, hence the programme's title, A Heart in Pilgrimage. It begins with Liszt's own preface to his second St. Francis legend.
Amongst the numerous miracles of St. Francis of Paola is the celebrated legend of him crossing the Straits of Messina. The ferryman refused to take on their boat somebody so down at heel. Without more ado, he simply stepped in all assurance onto the sea. In an admirable drawing which I own, thanks to the gracious generosity of Madame the Princess Caroline Wittgenstein, this miracle is represented according to traditional Catholic iconography. St. Francis, standing on the turbulent waves. His cloak is spread beneath his feet. He raises one of his hands as if to command the elements. In the other, he holds a burning coal, symbol of the internal fire which inflames the disciple of Jesus Christ. Calmly, he contemplates the heavens where, in eternal and immaculate glory, shines the emblem of St. Francis, the supreme word, Caritas.
That is Liszt at the height of his powers. Everything that we associate with his music is there. Diabolic virtuosity, gypsy abandon, gentle poetry, drama, ardour, passion, intensity, heroic grandiloquence, religious fervour. It strikes the perfect balance between high seriousness and concert showpiece. Not surprisingly, it was one of his favourite pieces. Together with its companion, St. Francis of Assisi preaching to the birds, which has the same elements in a different mix, it's what he liked to play to friends. He was even playing it in 1886, a few weeks before his death, to a Parisian gathering that included Saint-Saëns and Fauré. Is it so-called program music? It's easy enough to see it simply as an extraordinarily vivid piece of scene painting, using every resource of keyboard virtuosity and all the resources of the contemporary instrument, the full keyboard extent, its enormous resonant properties and sustaining power, the very durability of the iron frame and metal strings. But Liszt was quite specific about program music.
The program has no other end than to make some preliminary allusion to the psychological motives that have impelled the composer to create his work, and which he has sought to embody in it.
In this piece, the symbolism, both poetical and musical, is completely attuned to its religious aims. The sea, that archetypal element of chaos and destructive power, the hymn-like theme, is a frequent musical symbol of the pilgrim, the holy man. There are also Liszt's personal musical symbols, the threatening chromaticism, particularly when it's made to pile up in the sustaining pedal. The diatonic harmony. Simple common chords which represent the certainty of faith, in particular that massive E major heard at the end of the piece. The virtuosity is an integral part of the composition. It's that creates the overwhelming effect. The immense gestural power of the solo performer, the sheer physical difficulties that he has to overcome, are a visible manifestation of, on the one hand, the elemental terrors that threaten to overwhelm the saint, and on the other, the doubts that he and Liszt must overcome to reach a safe haven. It's a tour de force, yes, but it's one that dramatically and forcefully enacts the experience before us. So, behind its picturesque program, what this piece does so clearly incarnate is the battle and triumph of faith against overwhelming odds, against all the doubts that threaten to engulf it. And that, for Liszt, was a spiritual combat in which he was engaged throughout his life. It belongs to the early 1860s, to the period when he was living in Rome, when he'd embraced his Roman Catholic faith to the radically committed extent of becoming an abbé. That is, he took the minor orders of priesthood. In the course of the accompanying ceremonies, his confession had been heard by the Pope himself. Evidently, the catalogue of Liszt's sins was so interminable that the exasperated Pope is reported to have cried, "Enough, enough, Liszt, go and confess to your piano." He was spot on. Liszt's entire work is confessional. It's an intense effort to lay bare every corner of his soul so as to accept the presence of God, so as to make St. Francis's emblem of charity his own. That's why there's such a fascinating diversity of personality revealed in Liszt's work. And it was to the piano that Liszt was able to confess every part of himself.
My piano is for me what a boat is to a sailor or a horse to an Arab. Even more, for it has been my language, my life, my very self.
The reason that piece is so alluring is that it seems completely spontaneous, unpredictable, improvised. This gypsy music seems to spring from some very deep individual creative impulse. The gypsy scale on which it's based is outside European culture, but it's universally appealing. It gives the impression of a music coming from some primal emotional level, untamed, quite untouched by any artistic tradition or mediation. Music just happening, direct from the soul. Liszt, who had a positive genius for titles, introduced into music the title Rhapsody to characterize this. A rhapsody was a Greek epic poem recited by the rhapsode, a sort of strolling player, inspired and excited by his own skill and fantasy as he unfolded his story. That kind of music and music making, which reveals the soul so directly and so candidly, was for Liszt an ideal. But before he was able to capture this rhapsodic style compositionally, there was a long period when it was only there in his playing. He was the rhapsode of the keyboard, par excellence, hypnotic, astonishing, charismatic.
As the closing strains began, I saw Liszt's countenance assume that agony of expression, mingled with radiant smiles of joy, which I never saw in any other human face, except in the paintings of our Saviour by some of the early masters. His hands rushed over the keys, the floor on which I sat shook like a wire, and the whole audience were wrapped in sound when the hand and the frame of the artist gave way. He fainted in the arms of a friend, and we bore him out in a strong fit of hysterics.
No wonder Liszt came to call this his Glanzperiode, the razzle-dazzle years. But in fact, his performance career was relatively brief. The last professional public concert was in 1847, when he was 35. Although its impact and his celebrity was colossal. He was a superstar. As Henry Rees suggests, a lot of it was completely over the top, but then that's how things were. Concerts in those days were pretty crazy affairs, given by a bevy of star attractions, who were almost like circus or music hall turns, each with his own particular sleight of hand and his own virtuoso party pieces, usually paraphrases and fantasies on the operatic hit tunes of the day. Liszt was a part of all that, but he was also bigger than all that, and he started turning things his own way, which has remained our way. For example, he was the first person to put the instrument with the keyboard at right angles to the stage so that the full power of the piano's sonority was projected at the audience. He was the first person to play from memory, or to put it another way which better explains its impact, he was the first person to play by heart. And by eventually turning himself into the only star attraction, he invented the solo concert, and it happened at a concert in London, the name by which we still know it, the recital. He was creating the conditions in which the piano and the solo performer, and hence his future work, could flourish. Berlioz quite categorically dubbed him the pianist of the future. He made sure he saw off the challenge of rivals like Sigismund Thalberg, but not before he'd appropriated Thalberg's great trick of the trade, making two hands sound like three. Here's Liszt's brilliant use of that technique in his concert study Un Sospiro. Playing from memory, playing by heart, effectively sums up what was going on in these preparatory years, the years of pilgrimage, as Liszt called them. He was busy stocking his memory with things seen, read, heard, felt, recording his experiences. There were many experiences. There was a sustained emotional relationship with Countess Marie d'Agoult and the birth of his 3 children. There were visits to almost every corner of Europe. And in over 1,000 recitals, all the paraphrases and fantasies he was playing were exercising his sensibility, his poetic response, his rhapsodic sense. Collecting together all the compositional requirements to fix all this, to record it once and for all, took a long time. He had to develop formidable powers of invention. After all, if you're going to remain forever spontaneous and unpredictable, the moment you use something, then you have to leave it and find something new. In our 20th century age of ceaseless experimentation, that brings Liszt very close to us. It also explains his fabulous legacy to our century, and Aladdin's cave, which almost everybody has plundered. There was also a deeper problem. Liszt remarked once to a friend that what people call my immense success is little consolation for my inner sadness. He was beset by doubts. Throughout his life, Liszt would be subject to periods of spiritual dejection, to feelings of uselessness and unworthiness. 1847 was the turning point. Liszt met and fell in love with this woman, the Princess Caroline von Sayn-Wittgenstein. She had, and has had ever since, a fairly bad press. She was considered interfering, pathetic, even grotesque with her constant cigar smoking. She was a married woman, and so in her own day she was ignored and despised. And yet she gave up everything for Liszt: respectability, vast Russian estates with armies of serfs. Her only consolation seems to have been that of knowing that Liszt could shake the world. And with her at his side, he did. She wasn't just his bedmate, she was also his soulmate. She was industrious, intellectually challenging, highly emotional, high-minded, and fervently devout. She gave Liszt, and it's his word, serenity. She awakened a real strength of purpose, a real commitment to ideals, to his faith, to confidence in the strength of his own feelings, and to helping others. She helped him to see who and what he was. He gave up the public concert world, never to return, and accepted a long-standing invitation to become music director to the Grand Duke of Weimar. At last, the confessions to piano could begin. Compositionally, it's like a dam bursting. The output was prodigious. In 10 years, Liszt completed about 90% of all his music, most of the piano music, as well as a large amount of orchestral music. And all this as well as conducting and championing the work of others, notably Berlioz and Wagner, generally turning Weimar into a sort of musical workshop, with himself as the central catalyst figure. That live coal which his patron saint St. Francis holds in his hand, and which stared at Liszt from his desk in Weimar, must have seemed to him a potent symbol of his creative fire. He must have been getting things down on paper at such a fantastic rate that hardly anything of the incandescence of the original inspiration can have dissipated. He'd achieved an artistic ideal somewhere between improvisation and calculation, between emotional turbulence and intellect, between the unruly and the controlled. Broadly speaking, the compositions articulate various states of faith and doubt, from salvation to damnation. They're musical meditations, contemplations, harmonie poétique et religieuse, the poetry of religious emotional fervour, works that seek to reveal the grace of God. Liszt once said about one of them, "I prayed rather than composed." And there are less blissful, more tormented, dramatic works, like the Faust Symphony, like the great B minor sonata, dramas of a soul in search of salvation. The compositional materials were, in a sense, to hand. In his concertizing days, his paraphrases had, of course, always been based on pre-existing material. By the time his composing period came, he'd collected for himself such a bottom drawer of sketches and abandoned or unfinished projects that his own work was almost invariably to take as source material these found objects. The poet George Herbert once defined prayer as the soul in paraphrase heart in pilgrimage. And this gets us very close to what Liszt was doing. He paraphrased himself. This is playing from memory, playing by heart, in its profoundest sense. The longest of the transcendental studies is called memory, ricordanza. The source material is the very bottom of the bottom drawer. That elegant bel canto melody was something he'd first written down at the age of 15. As the 1850s wore on, Liszt's serenity began to slip away. Life hadn't been easy for him and Princess Caroline. Her protracted search for a church-recognized divorce had not produced results. His artistic policies in Weimar were coming under increasing attack. He didn't try to counter any of this, but lapsed again into his melancholy. All his achievements seemed wasted and useless. He went off to Rome, into retreat, and there the renewal of his spirit began. He said, "At my age, what one has to search for is to be found internally, not externally." We're back at the period of the St. Francis legends. In 1868, he was offered a suite of rooms in the Villa d'Este, in the hills outside Rome, and this move was to signal a spiritual move to even greater inner regions of almost mystical devotion. Here he wrote a third Année de Pèlerinage, but this time the pilgrimage is an internal, soul-searching one. The images of his daily life in the Villa d'Este, its famous cypresses, its extraordinary system of fountains, became images of divine will and power, whilst the cypresses inspired two threnodies, funeral hymns. His magnificent work, Fountains at the Villa d'Este, suggests the renewal of life in the hereafter. It has at its heart a quotation from St. John's Gospel. but the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. That music glows with such transcendent power that it would be nice to be able to say that Liszt had reached a state of grace. He was the grand old man of European music, endlessly celebrated, an established public figure. But spiritually, he'd achieved a state of almost total withdrawal. In the final works, all trace of the public manner has gone. They are intensely private meditations on death, elegies, threnodies, funeral music. Liszt's Catholic, his Franciscan reading will have exhorted him to renunciation and simplicity as a route to God's grace. And these final works are the end products of his lifelong search for this essential simplicity. They're his attempt at that most difficult feat of exécution transcendante, that of ego transcendence, of conquest of self. I'm going to end with one of the most remarkable of them, the first of the two pieces called Funeral Gondola, written in Venice in 1882, a few weeks before Wagner died there. Indeed, Liszt felt that it had prefigured that event in some extraordinary way. The same symbols we've encountered earlier in this program are now unfamiliar territory. Water, which in the St. Francis legend was the sea, and which represented chaos, fear, and doubt, became in Fountains at the Villa d'Este a symbol of God's gift of eternal life. Here, it's the element that carries one on the final journey. Tonality and diatonic harmony, those common chords which represented certainty of faith and consolation, are left far behind. My fingers tell me that, like the St. Francis legend, it's trying to end in E major, but this time it's completely unfamiliar, even unrecognizable. This is no certainty. For those who read music, Liszt will not even allow himself the consolation of notating it as E major. There's, in all senses of that word, no resolution. Liszt has reached the limits of the accessible, the limits of what music can say, symbolized by silence, the ultimate unpredictable.